I will speak about the research done on the data from Transparency International. It is a crusading NGO, and we will come back to that. It makes the TI Corruption Perception Index with a scale from 1 to 10. It is an honesty index, 0 for fully corrupt, 10 for fully honest. Now I turn it around because we want to speak about corruption. So I have turned it around. So 10 is fully corrupt and 0 is not corrupt. So that's, well, some people do it, some people don't. It is the average of a dozen indices, polls, surveys of businessmen or journalists knowing countries. So they have collected all this evidence, and there's a handful of data per country. So we know that the measurement uncertainty is about 0.5. So if countries are different from one is 5 and one is 5.5, they're not really significantly different. But one is 5 and another is 10, then certainly they are very different. It started in 1995 with 41 countries, and it has now reached 180 countries, which it already reached in 2005. So now there are almost 3,000 observations, and this is great for research. And there must have been written 400 or 500 articles about this. So we know a lot about this. There was a large pre-data literature, and then the data-based literature starting from 2002 to 2000 to 2002. There were 3 articles published in these years independently, and my article is one of them, my first article. So it has been cited 1,000 times, so it's kind of a standard problem. We all know that poor countries are more corrupt. But before we had the data, it was not a nice thing to say because people were feeling we were adding insults to injury. But now we discuss data, and that's much more easy. We don't need to include a lot of morality about this. We know and we can speak about the pattern and why is this pattern there. Here are the 2010 observations for corruption index and for income, defined as a logarithm to real GDP per capita. Now, why do I take the logarithm? I take the logarithm to press the countries together. So it's much easier to see all countries, else it'll be a long tail. But now you can see this is poor countries here have a corruption level around 7.5, 8. And here are the rich countries, the OECD countries, and you can see the average curve, and I will not tell you about how it is calculated. It bends very clearly, and then it goes down dramatically. And you probably all know that Denmark is at the rock bottom as the least corrupt country. And that gives Danes, when they work abroad, a little bit of a problem. We don't really understand this. All right. The index moved quite slowly. Countries have improved by 1% over 10 years, or 1 point over 10 years, but it's not many countries, and normally improvement take a long time. And part of this is due to measurement, but another part is due to the fact that it really moves slowly. So in low income countries, corruption is 6 to 8. In middle income countries, 4 to 8. And in high income countries, 4 to 1. And 1 is, I'll come to that in a moment. There is a big bend for income around 9.7. You can see it here. Here is a really big bend, and it starts to go down. This is where it is income, the log is 9.7, and this means it's around 16,000 US dollars. All right. I will give you some numbers. First, the best 10. And if you look at the best 10, they have this between 3.5 and 1. Denmark, Finland, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, Norway, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Iceland. But Iceland is not on the top 10 list where Sweden and Germany and Canada are. So you can see this is a good 10. All right, then there are the bad 10s. South Sudan, Somalia, Venezuela, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Eritrea, Equatorial Guinea, Nicaragua, Sudan, North Korea, and if these two are not on the 10, but then Afghanistan and Haiti are. So when you look at these countries, it is pretty clear that the good end are small, peaceful, wealthy democracies that has been so for a long time. It's not something that comes quickly. It has been so for a long time. The only really funny exception is Singapore. Singapore is a very rich country with very little corruption. It has almost the same standard of living as Denmark, but it has not a good democracy. It has I don't know what you call it, but a steered democracy in some sense. If you criticize the government, you will end up paying a very large fine. The bad end are small, war-torn, poor dictatorship, including two oil countries, Venezuela and Equatorial Guinea. They're the strange exception. But you know, Venezuela has been in a complete mess for quite some time, and the standard of living in Venezuela has not increased since the mid-50s, which is 1950s. So for 75 years, Venezuela have had about the same standard of living, and now it's going down. Equatorial Guinea is known for the country that has had the worst government. But it's a very small country. Now, so in some sense, these are countries where people are desperate. And if you're desperate, you take what you can. So it's not something, I mean, you have very high inflation, you have poverty, and you have long civil wars. Then all institutions break down and countries become very corrupt. Now, let me mention some cases. If you take big countries, Nigeria is the biggest country in Africa. It's rather corrupt. Russia, of course, is very corrupt. Brazil, a little bit better. India and China are the same, almost halfway. USA has 3 points. So USA is fairly good, but not perfect. In Europe, Germany 2.1 and France and UK pretty much the same, and France a little bit higher. France and the US have for a long time been about the same with these 3 points. And we will come to the special kind of corruption in these countries. It has to do with political corruption in the sense that political parties are paid by kickbacks from public contracts. So obviously this is a corruption thing. In EU has the problems of Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, and Italy, and then the close country to Europe, which is Ukraine. You can see Ukraine has a fairly high corruption, and it's almost the same as Russia. At least not, they don't differ by half a point. So this is the kind, and then there's a case of twins, which I am very interested in. The two neighboring countries with a 5,000-kilometer border, same culture, same language, everything the same, except that Argentina has corruption of 6.2, Chile 3.3. It's almost down to the US level. And of course, Argentina has had a very bad economic development, while Chile is now the richest country in Latin America. So this is kind of the pattern. Now we will look at the explanations just a moment. Now, there's a very clear connection to income. But then, of course, there's this huge discussion of the causality. Now, this is almost the case in economics. You have two variables, you find a correlation, and then you want to find out what is the causality. And most of the debate goes to the relationship between the corruption and economic growth, where the correlation is quite weak. It's not so that countries with high corruption has low economic growth. Unfortunately not. Nice if it was so, but it is not. So are we rich because we are honest, or are we honest because we are rich? Now, my studies point to the later possibility. We are honest because we are rich. And I'll show you data in a moment that show that countries that begin to become rich also have falling corruption. But since it is such a slow-moving thing, it takes some time. Transparency International, I first mentioned that they are a crusading institution, which means that they're very strong believers that corruption is a big growth killer. Corruption is bad for everything. Obviously, we all agree that corruption is morally bad. That is, I think, you can, if you make a poll for all people in the world, they will all agree on this. Corruption is morally bad. But is it also harmful for economic development? This is the interesting question. When we were poor, we were also quite corrupt. Now, these data I'm discussing started in 1995, but there is a historian at Aarhus University, Mette Frisk, who wrote a PhD thesis where she found data for Danish administration going back a long time. And she claims that around here 1800, a little before 1800, corruption was as bad in Denmark as this is Nigeria today. But then it started to fall. And it started to fall quite strongly. And as we can saw on the graph, when it started to fall, it fell very fast. China, South Korea, they are some of the fastest growing countries. Now, when they were poor, they were quite corrupt. Now, I can only start here in 95 when the data started. The country had started their famous growth before that. But they were quite corrupt as far as we know. And you can see even in 1995, China was quite corrupt. It is still corrupt, but much less. So our judgment is it will become much less in the next 25 years. South Korea is pretty much the same. It was a very corrupt country. And it started to grow very fast, and now corruption is falling. The same thing with Taiwan. So, I mean, it is very difficult to make causality tests. And causality test, when you are dealing with long-run relations, it is particularly difficult. I have tried some methods, and I think that most of the causality is from becoming rich and corruption falls. There are two theories. One is the sand theory, and it says corruption is sand in the machine of development. It is obviously a cost, and it involves rent seeking, which make regulations that force business to pay extra. There are quite some examples. The most famous thing was in the beginning of the development in Russia. They introduced in the beginning of the liberal period in Russia, they introduced a lot of tariffs. And why did they do that? Because tariffs is a very good place to collect corruption fee, and that financed the political parties. So the Greece theory is corruption make regulations less strict. And in some sense, it is good for business. So perhaps corruption is grease of the machine of growth. Now, we can really say all regulations have two things. They are nouns and means to do good, and they often do. I'll give you a few examples in a moment. And they generate rents, because all regulations create some kind of monopoly, and monopoly gains, monopoly profits. So all regulation have these two sides. Tariff, is that meant to produce domestic producers? By giving them a price equal to the world market plus tariffs. Other countries retaliate, it is bad in general. So tariffs are bad for economic efficiency. And when you look at the US when they're introducing tariffs, I don't think there are any reputable economists in the US who think it's a good thing. So I think it is quite obvious that this is a bad thing. We have the taxi law in Denmark. Quite a complicated and big taxi law. Is it made to support consumers or the taxi branch? I think it is quite obvious that it is made to support the taxi branch, not consumers. All right, thus sand theory means that it undermines good regulations. Let me take an example. Vaccinations is painful for you, but it has a positive externality as it would stop diseases. Several big diseases, big killers, have actually been exterminated by vaccination. So it's a little bit painful for you. It also helps you not to get a disease, but it has what is called a very big positive externality. If everybody is vaccinated against a certain disease, the disease will disappear. Now, if you can, and you have this World Health yellow card with stamps, and when you want to cross countries in Africa, cross borders in Africa, you should show this. So you want to have a WHO stamp. Now, if you bribe the vaccination and pay half and don't get any vaccination, it's nice for you, but it is bad for society. And of course, it also may give you the disease. So you run a risk and it's bad for society. Nevertheless, this is quite common in Africa. And I have been at a vaccination center and I was traveling out of Nigeria. I was going home. I have been for 2 years in Nigeria. And then I had to go out and they had no clean needles in the vaccination clinic. So I paid them and got the stamp. I had to. So I was forced to be a little corrupt. Now I had tried very hard during my 2 years not to be corrupt, but you can be brought in a situation. There are fire inspectors in Russia. Well, if you give them a bottle of whiskey, then they will say, oh, there's no problem. So, I mean, then you have the Greece theory. It undermined rent seeking, and that's great for development. To the extent that the rent seeking is a serious problem. There are many, so people have tried to estimate models which have the two. Is it good or bad? Does the sand or the Greece theory work strongest? And there is quite a literature on this. And it's very difficult to identify things that somehow point out which of the two it is. There's a guy called Pierre Méon in Belgium, who has made a number of very famous studies and has got quite different results. So it's very difficult. All we can say is both work. And which one is the dominating? I think in some countries it's the one, in some other countries it's the other one. Very small effect of corruption. Therefore, there's very small effect of corruption and growth. This is very sad. Now, we will all like that good things follow from being moral. Now, we can speak a little bit about the type of economic system. Now, the type of economic systems we have in the world, nearly everybody will say we have a kind of capitalism in nearly all countries. There are few exceptions. North Korea, Venezuela, Eritrea, Laos. There's a few examples. Even China is a capitalist. So is it a market capitalist or political capitalism? What is the difference? Market capitalism built on fair competition of firms. Political capitalism has other names, state capture, crony capitalism. It is defined in 2 steps. There are some people who are political insiders. They are in all countries. Political insiders are people with some power over the political system. Now, in many countries, it also includes business people. Political capitalism is when a significant part of GDP is generated by political insiders using their power. This is not good. There are always political insiders in political capitalism, but it might be small or large. And once again, in Denmark, it's the one country with the lowest degree of political capitalism. Politicians, as a general rule, don't get rich. They have moderately good salaries, or fairly good salaries, and nice pensions, but they don't get rich. And of course, they might know top business people, but they very rarely has been shown that they change laws and so on to help business. So the main effect of political capitalism is a redistribution to political insiders from other people. Other people don't like it. Journalists reveal it, legal system punish it, so it requires that the insiders have some control over media and the legal system. So if you have political capitalism, you have reduced democracy. Now, there is something called the State Capture Index, which is an index of political capitalism. It is very parallel to corruption index. And it has high values in LDCs and low in the West. And it takes a long time to get a democracy to work and a legal system to work. It is highest in non-democracies. Most dictators get rich too. There are many examples of dictators that becomes very rich. Some not, but I mean, there's some people who don't care about anything. Some dictators only care about power. But most dictators also want to be rich, and you know, many examples. And in poor LDCs, politics is the best road to wealth. And we know a dictator is above the law. Thus, the legal system is part of his administration. And there is this concept of a stationary bandit, where the ruler sees his country as his business and organize it so that he receives a fraction of all transactions. I'm writing a paper with a Tunisian, and he tells me the story of the former dictator Ali, who was kicked out, and it was quite clear that he has organized a stationary banditry system. The most famous thing is Nicaragua, which was ruled for a long time by the Somoza family, that somehow made 1% of GDP. And they put a lot of it in Swiss bank accounts. Is it bad for business and for development? No, it is probably better for development that you run your country as a business than if you just come in to plunder. And it is also better than civil war, and it proves much better than socialist systems, which is kind of an interesting and shocking thing. The famous case is Costa Rica versus Nicaragua. Nicaragua was ruled by the Somoza family, and they were consistently 25% poorer than Costa Rica. So this was the cause of having stationary bandits. When the Sandinistas came in, the difference changed from 25% to 75%. So they managed in a very short period to ruin the country. And it has had very big trouble since. A few dictators do not care for money, and they are not necessarily the nicest. Antonio Salazar lived like a monk. He was a dictator in Portugal for a very long time, one of the few professors of economics who have been a dictator, and he was it for a long time, but he lived like a monk. He has no family and lived like a monk. He didn't steal anything, and to this day, Portugal has a fairly low corruption level. Stalin was not corrupt either. How big the corruption was in the Soviet system is a long story. It was somewhat of a different, but as soon as the communist system disappeared, there was a very serious crisis, economic crisis. Income fell, and there was a lot of inflation, and it took some time to get back. In this period, there was, of course, a big growth of corruption. Now, this is the political capitalism index and the corruption index. And you can see it's pretty much a straight line. It's not a fully straight line, but it's pretty much a straight line. And you can see here the rich countries have in this end on both indices. The South European countries are getting close. And the East Asian countries, most of them are also getting close, the rich East Asian. So this kind of show that when countries have been rich for some time, South European countries were behind as late as in the 50s. There was in the early and most of the 60s, they were considerably poorer than Northern Europe. They have caught up quite nicely. Spain is a pretty wealthy country nowadays. Portugal is not bad either. Greece had its big crisis, but by and large, they are catching up very nicely. The East Asian countries have these countries that has become rich, but there are, you can see some strange cases, and this is essentially Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong has, of course, is now ruled by China, moved from being a British colony into being Chinese province. So there is a somewhat, Singapore has not got very much democracy, but it's coming. So in some sense, you can see countries that are behind and become rich. After some time, they also adjust corruption and get much more better democratic system. You can see the crisis in South Korea in the last year as a typical example where anti-democratic methods was used by a prime minister and he was actually kicked out. So in some sense, the system reacts and create more democracy once it has got accustomed to. So there is this nexus between corruption, state capture, and democracy. It's strongly, both corruption, state capture, and democracy is strongly related to income. And we can solve some of the causal structure. My finding is that income is the key variable, and then T and C go down and democracy goes up. It's very nice to see. But these effects take a long time to develop. I want to say these findings are controversial because, I mean, you want to have strong statistical proofs, but statistical proofs of causality are by necessity very difficult. I will not speak about it. There's a large literature and economists love these discussions, but they are difficult and they require high technical skills. Now, Transparency International said its key is to reduce corruption. If this is the key, they should first reduce corruption and then everything will follow. It has proved to be very difficult. Evidence is weak, but beliefs are strong. And the policy conclusion from Transparency International is we can contribute by forcing or urging our firms to be honest abroad. Well, how long time have I spoken? Already half an hour?
Yes, if you could wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes.
I will do so.
Yes.
And we have had laws against corruption, but it is a very difficult complex. You can see there is some cases here, and you can study if they grow faster. They don't really. So there's a high corruption equilibrium. Then when it starts to fall, and here it falls very fast, it will fall. There's 3 dynamic mechanisms. One is punishment. You cannot punish everybody, but you can punish a few. So it's a low corruption punishment system works very well. In old Russia and China, they had a stiff planning system that needs some corruption to work. But if it was too dark, then they were punished. You have this political corruption. Now, corruption is a business. Thus, you need advertisement. If punishment is weak and uncertain, you can advertise that you are corrupt by conspicuous consumption. Civil servant on a modest salary drive a Mercedes-Benz. If you meet a civil servant who has a modest salary and drive a Mercedes-Benz, you know he's corrupt. There was a time when Russian costume officers had expensive gold chains or fine houses, so they're conspicuous consumption. Then there's also job sorting. There's a model currently. If you have 2 kinds of people, corrupt and honest, 2 kinds of jobs with large and small corruption potential, start with same salary. The honest sees both jobs equally, the corrupt sees just with highest potential. So it means there's an excess demand for a job with a high corruption potential. So the wages in a high potential job is competed down, the honest move to low potential jobs. So it sort people and corruption goes up. I can mention some examples. These dynamic processes work in the reverse too. One corruption fall, it becomes easy to punish. Once the risk of punishment is high, it is not so much fun to engage in high living on a low salary. Jobs with high corruption potential become easier to monitor. Thus, corruption starts to fall. And when it starts to fall, it falls. I will jump this. What are the consequences? And now this will be the last slide. If we are moral, if Danish firms abroad are moral, then there is a short-run loss of business. There might be a long-run gain of reputation also for the country. People know Danish firms are honest. So if we are not short-run gain, but in the long run, the rumor is that you are corrupt and you will have to pay from now. So there is a very complicated trade-offs here, and it is very difficult. Now the solution is, in many cases, that people employ agents to do the dirty deals. Now, give us contract, we don't want to know how. This is a deal that many firms have done, and then they are at arm's length. On the other hand, we know, we have a suspicion, others will know too. And how gray are gray? Do you just employ a noble lawyer? Everybody knows him, or do you employ outright gangsters? Well, I can tell you many stories now. So I have this question, can we run business as angels? Now I will go out of this show.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for sharing these interesting perspectives. It gives a very good kind of overview of the country and political climate that many of our companies are engaging in. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand or post it in the chat. In the meantime, I do have a question.
Yes.
So let's say that you are, on a very practical level, you are a company and you are entering a potential new country, a new market. How can you translate what you have said into some sort of guidance? What should the company look for in terms of types of corruptions that would be disfavorable for them?
Well, you know, I spoke to a man who started his business in Russia, a Danish firm and he was sent out to start a business in Russia. And after a little while, some people came into his office and said that you should give us $500,000, else you're going to have some problems. So what do you do? So what he did was he employed a Chechen security company. It was not so cheap, but as a result, nobody came to his office anymore. So what can you do? Do you want to let your family be threatened? Or should you send home your family and be there alone with a security guard? It's a very difficult question and a very difficult. Now, if everything you do is clear and well announced, it's perhaps not so bad. But then you start to apply for contracts. And when you apply for contracts, you might again meet some people who tell you that you can get this contract under certain conditions. And what will you do? I don't know. It's a very difficult question, and I'm glad I have not personally been in this situation, but it is very hard. I knew when I lived in Sokoto, there was a British guy who was sports trainer at one of the colleges, but he has grown up in Nigeria and he spoke fluent Hausa, and he knew a lot of politicians. So he kind of retired as sports teacher and became expert in making contracts, in helping business people making contracts. He was paid for this, but obviously he was in a gray zone.
Mm.
What will you do? Well, if you announce it on your homepage or make it clear that you employ this agent, it is perhaps not so bad as if you don't announce it. It's not so secret. Well, I don't know.
I also heard these were studies claiming that if you enter a country and basically the first time that you engage in a monetary transaction that is corruption related,
Yes.
you basically create a lot of barriers in front of you, because the rumor kind of spreads that
Yes.
this is a company that will engage in corruption. So if you don't have the patience to go through the procedures in the right way and you pay people instead, you just create a lot of barriers for yourself. Is there any scientific evidence for that?
There are certainly many case studies showing it. On the other hand, we had, when I lived in northern Nigeria, there was a big Palestinian company that came in, and they were known to be corrupt, and they got a lot of contracts.
Yeah.
Everybody knew that they paid. So it was kind of, what should I tell you? It depends on how bad the situation is, what you can do. On the other hand, the administration also had a lot of contract with a British company on the same kind of contracts. Now, the British company was not so obviously corrupt, but I think they were also corrupt. I don't know.
You know, when you showed the list before of the different countries, the correlation between income and corruption, those countries that moves quickly in terms of eliminating corruptions, from a governance perspective, can we conclude something? What do they do? What is the kind of governance measures that they?
There's a lot of famous proposals. One of the proposals is to give civil servants a better salary, so they don't need to be corrupt. But on the other hand, well, the state doesn't have a lot of money. So it is a possibility of paying better salaries. Another thing is, of course, to have a better police. And really, those who announce that they are corrupt can be caught and can be put, if you put in jail this is a Chinese method. If you have corruption in provinces, the Chinese method is, if there's a little bit of corruption, it's all right, you don't mind. But if there's some people who become very rich, they will be arrested and put in jail for a long time. So in some sense, you could have a police that take the most outrageous cases. And then if you give civil servants a reasonable salary. But you know, where I lived, the man who had the biggest Mercedes-Benz was the Sultan. But number two was the, what is it called, Director of Public Works. He has the second biggest, and he has, of course, not wanted to buy as big as Mercedes as the Sultan. This would be an insult. But he drove around in a very expensive Mercedes. Why did he do this? How could he afford it on his salary? Now, when there was a next coup, that was after I had left, this man he was a Palestinian guy, and he took all his, took 10 valises of luggage and went out in the airport. And then the question was, should we arrest him and put him in jail? But then there will be a court case, and then he will tell the names of a lot of people who has been involved in this. So after 2 days where he was waiting, it was decided that he could fly. And that means that there was a cutout. It was important that he was not a Nigerian. It was important that he was a foreigner who could go away and disappear. Yeah, it's very difficult, these things.
I also, before I was working here in Access to Innovation, I was a few years with the World Bank, and they talked about the degree of what they said elite capture in corruption. So at that time, I was working in Laos in Southeast Asia, and they said there was a high degree of elite capture, meaning that the money flows up to a small elite.
Capture, yes.
Then you have other countries like India where the corruption is kind of spread out. A lot of people benefit from it.
Well,
can you say is there
more than a billion people, so it's not so easy. I mean, but of course, Nigeria has also a lot of a large country and a lot of corruption. But of course, the elite is much bigger in Nigeria, and it's much bigger in India.
Yeah. Okay, time is up.
Nobody else have asked?
Nobody else has any questions?
Good.
Okay. But Martin, thank you very much for your presentation. I think we are all a bit wiser than when we came in, and there was some very interesting perspectives. So thanks a lot for sharing your insights.